I live in a small single-story house on the edge of a quiet neighborhood. Most of my neighbors are retirees, so nights here are usually dead silent. I've always felt safe in this place. The kind of safe where you, Dan, even think twice about leaving the back door unlocked while you watered the garden. It was a Thursday night, close to midnight. ID just wrapped up a long project for work and decided I'd earned a glass of wine and a mindless binge of bad TV. My living room was dim, except for the warm glow of the lamp in the corner. And outside, it was pitch black. Around 11:30, I wandered into the kitchen to grab a snack. That's when something caught my eye. Movement just barely visible through the thin gap between my curtains. At first, I thought it was just the faint reflection of my own shadow in the glass. But then my brain caught up with my eyes. It wasn't a reflection. There was a man standing completely still at the edge of my driveway. He wasn't pacing or smoking or doing anything you could explain away. He was just standing there. He wore jeans, a dark hoodie, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. Nothing about him screamed danger at first glance. But the way he stood, angled slightly toward the road with his head turned toward my window, made my stomach knot. It wasn't casual. It was like he wanted to look, but also wanted to pretend he wasn't. I froze halfway between the counter and the fridge. My phone was still in the living room, and I didn't want to move too quickly in case he noticed me watching. The silence in the house felt louder somehow, like every breath I took was amplified. For about 30 seconds, though it felt like 5 minutes, neither of us moved. Then, without warning, he walked away toward the street, not down the road, just across it. Then he slipped into the darkness between two houses and was gone. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding, told myself it was probably nothing, and went to check the locks anyway. I turned on the porch light for good measure, then tried to focus back on my show. But about 20 minutes later, I heard it. The crunch of gravel under footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from outside. My heart was pounding before I even touched the blinds. When I peeked out, my stomach dropped. He was back. Only this time, he wasn't at the edge of the driveway. He was closer. It's maybe 15 feet from my front door. Same posture, same stillness. Only this time, his head was tilted just enough that I could see the pale lower half of his face under the brim of the cap. That's when I grabbed my phone and called 911, keeping my voice as low as possible. While I was on the phone, he stepped forward. Slowly, just one step, like he was testing the distance. Then, another. My porch light flicked on automatically with the motion, and that's when he bolted. Not toward the street. Back into the darkness between the same two houses. The police showed up 10 minutes later. They searched the area but didn't find anyone. One officer mentioned that there had been similar reports around the neighborhood over the past week. Always at night. Always someone standing silently in driveways, never saying a word. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he'll come back. But I can tell you this. I lock my back door now, and my front, and the windows. And every time I hear the sound of gravel under footsteps, I freeze. I was 16, living with my mom in a small 2-story house on the edge of a quiet town. From the outside, it looked like any other safe suburban home. White siding, a little front porch, an old oak tree shading the yard. Inside, it was cozy. But it also had a way of feeling too quiet when I was alone. The upstairs was basically my territory. My bedroom, a tiny bathroom, and a cramped little study area under the window. My mom worked nights at the hospital, which meant the house was mine most evenings. At first, I liked it. Freedom, privacy. But over time, I started noticing things. Small things that made the silence heavier. The fridge hum was fine, the ticking pipes were fine, even the occasional creak of wood was fine. Those were normal. But sometimes I'd hear a sound that didn't fit, and once you hear something that doesn't belong, you know. It was a Friday night in late autumn. Outside, the rain was steady, drumming softly on the roof and running in little rivers down the window glass. The streetlights blurred into halos in the mist. I had a frozen pizza in the oven, my phone in hand, and some random action movie playing on the TV in the living room downstairs. That's when it happened. A sound, faint but unmistakable, drifted down from upstairs. Footsteps, not a random house-settling groan. Not the kind of accidental creak from shifting wood, but a slow, steady tread. One foot, then the other, heel, then toe. I froze. The first thing I did was try to explain it away. Maybe I'd left a window cracked upstairs and the wind was rattling something. But the rhythm was too perfect, too human, and it was moving. I stared at the ceiling, tracking the sound in my head. It was coming from my bedroom. I knew because that is. Where the floorboards are the noisiest, right in front of my closet. And here's the part that made my stomach twist. Before coming downstairs earlier, I'd locked my bedroom door. I always did. Not for any real reason I could explain. Just habit. The steps grew louder. I muted the TV without even realizing I'd done it, and the whole house seemed to shrink around me. The rain outside wasn't comforting anymore. It was muffling, isolating. Whoever was upstairs could make as much noise as they wanted, and no one outside would hear. Then the footsteps stopped. The silence was suffocating. I could feel my pulse in my throat. I sat there, barely breathing, staring at the staircase as if I could see through the wall. And then, one more step, but not upstairs this time. On the first stair down, something inside me snapped. I didn't think. I didn't even grab my shoes. I bolted to the front door, flung it open, and ran barefoot into the cold, wet night. The rain instantly soaked my pajama pants, but I barely noticed. My only thought was get outside. I called my mom from the edge of the porch, my voice shaking. She told me to wait outside until she got home, so I stood there, hugging myself, staring at that closed front door, half expecting it to open at any second. When her headlights finally swept across the driveway, I almost cried with relief. We searched the house together. Every room upstairs was empty. Every window was latched from the inside. My bedroom door was still locked, but when I turned the key and stepped inside, I stopped. The lamp on my nightstand, the one I hadn't touched all week, was on, and the faintest trace of muddy footprints led from my closet to the door. I was 21, renting a tiny one-bedroom apartment on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. The kind with a narrow stairwell, peeling paint in the hallways, and doors that stuck when it rained. The neighborhood wasn't dangerous exactly, but it wasn't somewhere you'd leave your door unlocked either. At night, the street below was empty, except for the occasional late bus hissing past or a stray cat slipping through the shadows. It was a Saturday, and I'd stayed up way too late. Around 2 a.m., I was on my couch, scrolling my phone, with the TV muted so the soft hum of the radiator filled the room. Everything felt still. Then came the knock. 3 slow, heavy knocks on my front door. Not the polite kind you get from a neighbor. These were spaced out, each one deliberate, like whoever it was wanted me to know they weren't in a hurry. I froze. My first thought was maybe it was a drunk neighbor knocking on the wrong door. But I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway before the knock, just silence. And then it was there. I stayed still, listening. No more knocks. No voice saying who they were. Crept to the peephole, holding my breath. The hallway was empty. Confused, I backed away. And that's when the second set of knocks came. This time, they were louder, slower. My heart started to pound so hard I felt it in my fingertips. I looked through the peephole again. Nothing. Completely empty hallway. And then, as I stood there staring, the third set of knocks came, but they weren't on the door this time. They were on my living room wall, the wall that connected to the apartment next to mine. The one I knew was empty. The tenant had moved out a week earlier. Every instinct I had screamed to leave, but my body wouldn't move. I stood frozen until the knocking stopped. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour. When I finally worked up the nerve to open my door, the hallway was just as it had been before. Silent, still, and empty. I told myself it was just a prank. But when I turned back to go inside, I noticed something that made my stomach sink. On the outside of my door, right where the wood met the frame, were 3 fresh scratches. Deep ones. When I was 19, I rented a room in an old Victorian house that had been carved into 4 separate apartments. Mine was on the top floor, right under the roof, with slanted ceilings, creaky wooden floors, and a single window that looked out over the street. The place had charm, but it also had quirks, the biggest being the ancient heating system. The landlord said it was a beautiful old network of vents that connected the whole house. To me, it just meant the place moaned, clicked, and rattled every time the furnace kicked on. By winter, I'd gotten used to those sounds. I barely noticed the hollow clang of metal expanding or the faint hiss of warm air drifting through the vents. They were like background noise that helped me sleep. Until one night, when the sound wasn't just the furnace. It was just after 1 a.m. The wind was howling hard enough to make the thin glass in my window tremble. I was half asleep, drifting in and out when I heard it, a faint hiss from the vent above my bed. That wasn't unusual. What was unusual was the rhythm of it. The hiss wasn't constant. It came in short bursts, uneven, almost like breathing. I opened my eyes. At first, I thought it was my imagination, maybe the wind messing with the ducts. But then, layered under the soft rush of air, I heard something else, something deliberate. A voice. It was low, just on the edge of hearing, but I swear I heard words. I pushed myself up slowly, barely breathing. "Can you hear me?" The hair on the back of my neck rose instantly. It wasn't loud enough to be coming from the hallway. It wasn't muffled like a neighbor talking in another room. It was inside the vent. I stared at the grate above me, trying to think of an explanation. Maybe someone was in another apartment, talking near their own vent, and the sound had traveled. That had to be it. Except, can you hear me? It was clearer this time, and closer. I slid off the bed, feet landing softly on the cold wood floor, and just stood there, listening. The house was otherwise silent. I knew the tenants, a middle-aged couple on the first floor, and an older man on the second. None of them had a voice like this. "Come upstairs." My stomach dropped, because I was upstairs. I was on the very top floor. There was nothing above me but the attic, a space I had never seen and didn't have a key to. I grabbed my phone and turned on the flashlight. The vent was near the ceiling, so I dragged my desk chair underneath it, the legs scraping against the floor louder than I wanted. I climbed up, heart hammering. Up close, the vent smelled faintly of dust and rusted metal. The slats were narrow, but I pressed my eye to one of the gaps, shining the light inside. At first, I saw nothing but darkness. Then, something moved.
Ow.
2 small, pale fingers curled around the inside of the vent. Slowly, deliberately. The nails scraped against the metal with a sound so sharp it made my teeth ache. I lost my balance and fell backwards off the chair, hitting the floor hard. Pain shot up my spine, but I didn't stop. I scrambled toward the door, fumbled with the lock, and bolted out into the hallway. I didn't even grab my shoes. I just ran down the stairs and out into the snow, not stopping until I was halfway down the block. The next day I called the landlord. I told him exactly what I'd seen and heard. He tried to laugh it off, said maybe one of the other tenants had been playing a prank. I told him there was no way. The voice came from above me, and I was the top unit. When he finally agreed to check the ductwork with me, I insisted we start with the vent over my bed. We unscrewed the grate and shined a flashlight inside. The metal duct ran only a few feet, then stopped. It didn't connect to any other apartment. It ended in a sealed crawl space, just big enough for someone to curl up inside.
When I first moved into my basement apartment, I thought I'd scored a hidden gem. It was small, just a bedroom, a living room, and a narrow kitchen. But cheap, quiet, and in a safe neighborhood. The hallway was what sold me. It stretched from my bedroom door all the way to the living room. Long enough that when I stood at one end, the other seemed to fade into shadow. A single dim yellow bulb hung in the center, giving the whole place a warm, cozy glow. At first, it made me feel at home. But it didn't take long before the hallway started feeling wrong. The first thing I noticed was the light. I'd come home from work and find it on when I knew I'd turned it off. Sometimes I'd switch it off before bed and wake up to find it burning again, warmer than it should be, like it had been glowing for hours. Then came the footsteps. It was a little after midnight. I was lying in bed, scrolling through my phone, when I heard a faint creak. Not from above, like the neighbors. This came from the hallway. One step, a pause, another step. The sound was deliberate, slow and careful, like someone trying not to be heard but failing. The steps got closer and closer, until they stopped right outside my bedroom door. I stared at the thin strip of light under the frame. That's when I saw it. A shadow, narrow and unmoving, cutting across the glow from the hallway. I held my breath. Then, in a voice so low I almost thought I imagined it, a man whispered, "Are you awake?" I didn't move, didn't answer. After what felt like forever, the shadow shifted. The footsteps retreated, fading into the distance. When I finally opened the door, the hallway was empty. The light was on, and there was a faint smell in the air. Something metallic, almost like blood. A week later, it happened again. I was in the living room watching TV when the footsteps started. Steady, measured, coming down the hallway toward me. The light overhead flickered once, twice, then went out completely. And in the dark, I saw him. A tall, thin man stood at the far end of the hallway. His shoulders were hunched unnaturally high, and his head tilted far to one side, like his neck was broken, but he didn't care. His eyes caught the faint streetlight outside. They didn't blink, didn't move, just stared at me. We stood there in silence. My pulse pounded in my ears. Then he took a single, slow step forward. I bolted for my bedroom, slammed the door, and locked it. I heard him walking up and down the hallway for hours, sometimes stopping right outside my door, sometimes breathing, slow and steady, just inches away. He didn't leave until just before dawn. When the landlord came later that morning, I told him everything. He didn't laugh, didn't tell me I was imagining it. He just said, "Let's check the cameras." We pulled up the footage. Nobody came in, nobody left. The landlord stared at the screen, then finally said something I can't stop hearing. That hallway used to be longer. Before we sealed the other half. I should have moved out right then, but I didn't. And 2 nights later, it happened a third time. This time, I woke up to the sound of humming. Low, tuneless, and coming from the hallway. I grabbed my phone, switched on the flashlight, and stepped out of the bedroom. The light was on, but dimmer than usual, almost orange. The walls looked wrong, as if they'd been painted over in a color that didn't match, streaked and uneven. And the air was colder. Halfway down the hallway, I saw something new. A door. It shouldn't have been there. There had never been a door in that wall before, and it was open. Just a crack. The humming stopped. Then the man stepped out. Up close, I could see him clearly. His skin looked paper-thin, stretched too tightly over sharp bones. His lips were torn at the corners, as if his smile had been cut into his face. He leaned toward me, his head still tilted at that unnatural angle, and whispered, almost playfully, "You should have stayed asleep." The light went out. I ran. I don't even remember unlocking the front door. But I didn't stop until I was outside in the freezing air, barefoot, shaking. When I came back the next afternoon with the landlord, the hallway looked normal again. The door was gone, but the walls, the fresh paint was still there. And now, every night, no matter how many times I replace the bulb, the hallway light burns just a little warmer, as if it's been on for hours.